That's a go. Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. Bienvenue to this table ronde at the Castellier Festival. We're very happy to be here. This is a table ronde on two exhibits, beautiful exhibits that were mounted across the street at the Outremont Library of photographs on American puppet theater today, photographs by the esteemed photographer Richard Termine, who is here on our panel. And that exhibit is meeting a second exhibit on the work of Basil Twist, who is to my right, also on our panel today. Photographed by Richard, yes. So I will introduce everyone in one moment. I just want to say first that we are here on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and we will conduct ourselves in English, but when we come to asking you for your questions and commentaries, of course, please ask in French or English or any other language you choose, and we will translate together as we do in Montreal all the time. So welcome everyone, and thank you to Louise Lapointe and the crew here at the Miam for welcoming us tonight so nicely today. Okay, the introductions. I'll start. Richard Termine, all on my right, holds an MFA in puppet arts from the University of Connecticut, and in 1980 he began his association with Jim Henson Company as a puppet designer and builder for Muppet productions such as Sesame Street and The Muppet Show. During production, Richard began photographing behind the scenes, and this work led to a new career as a performing arts photographer, the performing arts photographer, I may say. He has photographed many of the world's leading performers and puppet artists, and he is currently a photographer for the culture desk of the New York Times, and his other clients include Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, the Metropolitan Opera, and he serves as the Jim Henson Foundation's vice president. So, Richard. Bienvenue.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll jump across to Cheryl Henson, who began her career building puppets for The Muppet Show while still in high school, graduated from Yale in 1984, and continued to work as a puppet and mask maker on various television and film productions. Since 1992, Cheryl has been the president of the Jim Henson Foundation, very important entity which we'll talk about as the panel unfolds, which supports innovative contemporary puppetry and really from coast to coast. It was a very, very important not only funder, but supporter and builder of the community we're gonna talk about. From 1992 to 2000, she was also executive producer of the biennial Henson International Festivals of Puppet Theater. And according to the company's website, these festivals presented 136 productions from 31 countries in 24 theaters throughout New York City. And the festival won Obie Awards, Drama Desk Award, and in 1994, I have to quote my dear friend Andrew Solomon, writing in the New York Times, described the festival as, quote, more imaginative than Broadway and greater in its impact than the movies. So that's high praise from a writer that we love. Cheryl Henson has served as the president of the Jim Henson Foundation since 1992. She's a supporter of puppetry arts and artists and serves as a board member of the Jim Henson Company. I will now move on to, again, jumping across to my right, Basil Twist, who I think many of you know. Basil Twist is originally from San Francisco, though he has adopted New York as his home. He's a third-generation puppeteer and the only American to have graduated from the École Normale Supérieure in Charleville-Mézières. Basil Twist's aesthetic is like no other, and regardless of the types of puppets used or the scale of the shows, the establishment of a dialogue with music is always at the heart of the approach. And I think you even see that in the photograph somehow, but we'll talk about that. He has taught at leading universities in the US, including Princeton, Stanford, Duke, NYU, RISD, and Brown. His work has received a number of awards: Obie, Drama Desk, Unima, Bessie Awards, and a New York Innovative Theater Award, and a Henry Hughes Award. I'll ask you about that later. He has been honored with a MacArthur grant, the Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. His productions have received valuable support from the Jim Henson Foundation, and he is the founder and artistic director of Tandem Otter Productions. Basil Twist, bienvenue. And last but not least, Kevin Augustine. Sorry, is this okay? You're checking what I got here? That's okay.
I don't remember supplying you.
Oh,
anything.
it's okay.
Go.
We'll see if you can correct me.
Yes.
Kevin Augustine is the director of Lone Wolf Tribe, which just completed performances here of Concert Anatomique in the Castelier Festival. Founded in 1997 in New York City, Lone Wolf Tribe embraces art as a catalyst for social change. The company's mission is to investigate, challenge, and spellbind with fearless original stories rooted in our collective human experience. Lone Wolf Tribe has dug into ancient religious schisms, exposed the true costs of war, mounted secret circus sideshows, fought for animal rights, and mourned the ongoing U.S. veteran suicide epidemic. A stage director, performer, and sculptor, Kevin is a creative virtuoso who values craft, physical rigor, and decidedly dark humor, which we like. His shows have been presented and critically acclaimed on 5 continents, and this is his first time performing in Montreal, I think. So welcome, everyone, and as I said, I hope that you will have questions and participate in the discussion. But I want to start by just reflecting as briefly as I can on what I felt walking through the exhibit across the street. And if you haven't had a chance, I really want to urge you to check it out. It's in the gallery that's connected to the Outremont Library, so it's literally across Saint-Just and to the left at the end of the block. Walking through these 2 exhibits, I had, I think, a very intense sense of history and of a kind of 30-year arc. And I know one could start much earlier, one could start later, you know, you can start history anywhere, but I think this was somewhat connected to my own, you know, sense of starting to be involved in puppet theater in the New York scene in the late 80s. But I felt that a whole kind of history was flashing in front of me in seeing this exhibit, and not only in the images, although certainly quite a bit, but also in the didactic cards, the texts that accompany the texts that accompany the images, in how they kind of mapped spaces and presenting organizations in particular that didn't exist in 1985 or 1990 or 1992, maybe, but then have come into existence and are now flourishing and have themselves given rise to, you know, generations of other organizations. And I'm not necessarily talking about puppet theater companies here, although of course they are there, but I'm really talking about institutional structures and funding and support and networks of puppeteers that just didn't exist, I don't think, and in the United States. And of course here we're focusing on the United States as the theme of the panel and sort of the theme of this Castelier Festival. And this is a bit my own bias as well, but I think this is a kind of an East Coast United States bias to some extent, and I take responsibility for that a little bit, but I couldn't help just making a list, and I hope you'll just indulge me for a minute, because so much energy and work and yes, funding, but support for artists is on evidence in these photos. And I just thought I'd call out. So in Cheryl's biography that I just that I just read. It mentioned the 5 international Jim Henson Foundation International Festivals from 1992 to 2000. Basil started the Dream Music program at Here Arts Center. We have St. Anne's Warehouse with an annual puppetry lab. Great Small Works even did 10 International Toy Theater Festivals from 1993 to 2013. But we have places like Dixon Place and La Mama and Teatro Sea and Coney Island Sideshows and 5 Miles and The Tank and New Victory Theater and the Metropolitan Opera and Lincoln Center, the Japan Society, Brooklyn Academy of Music, the Public Theater, the Asian Arts Alliance, the Swedish Cottage in Central Park, and training programs at Sarah Lawrence College. So that's the New York area for the most part. Outside of New York City, the O'Neill Conference, of course, is a major training and exchange site. The Ballard Institute of the University of Connecticut, the Puppet Showplace in Boston, the Atlanta Center for Puppetry Arts is major and is an older institution in this history. The Puppet Slam Network is a bit newer, but is funding nationally and internationally here in Canada as well. There's several Puppet Slams in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver that receive funding from Heather Henson, and very important network that exists around that funding. The Chicago Festival, of course, which I hear is going to become an annual festival. I don't know if that's true, as people here probably know. Cal Arts has been a very important site. The Coatson Center existed for some time as a center for puppetry and the arts, but Cal Arts remains a very puppet-friendly training program in theater and experimental animation and in film. Minneapolis is a major puppetry center. I also don't want to leave out Automata in Los Angeles. Anyway, that's my list, and I apologize for reading a list to you, which is a little boring. But I just wanted to give a sense of the breadth. And so many of the institutions that I just mentioned either didn't exist in, let's say, 1992 or 1990, or they weren't particularly interested in puppetry. And so the length of the list is meant to just give you a sense of a kind of explosion over certainly my adult life over 25, 30 years. You know, it's a lot to do with the people sitting here. It's really quite impressive how instrumental these folks have been. So I want to start perhaps by asking you guys to say a bit, you know, given that as a bit of a frame and a bit of a backdrop, what you see now in the stories that are being told, in the work that's being made, that, you know, is sort of coming out of this extraordinary few decades of development. And I'll let, you know, any one of you kick it off. Yeah. Is that too much to ask?
I'll
Yeah, Cheryl.
kick off
Please, Cheryl. Great.
because I
Wonderful.
think that when we first started the Henson International Festivals of Puppet Theater, that it really came from a desire to really show the extraordinary breadth of what was already happening, but was not necessarily getting out to the public. And that the the Puppeteers of America festivals, for the most part, were for the other puppeteers, and that they didn't always have a public component. And that when one of the reasons we wanted to do the festival, my father had been involved with the Puppeteers of America and with the International Organization of Puppeteers, the UNIMA, and he had advocated strenuously for an American chapter of UNIMA, starting in the 60s, and then was finally able to get that chapter in 1976 in time for the UNIMA festival in Moscow, so that they were able to announce doing an UNIMA festival in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing of building an audience for work was very important to my father, and was one of the original impetuses to doing the foundation, and was actually coming out of the 1980 festival that he did together with Nancy Staub in Washington, D.C., that they wanted to give more support to American artists, specifically with an eye to helping them to be able to create work that could join the international community, that could be seen in international festivals, because there were not very many American artists whose work was making it out onto the international scene. The ocean is wide. And Bill Baird was one of the few, and Bill was very active together with my father in advocating for Unima USA. So rather than just going to the 80s, I want to go to the decision to advocate for Unima USA, and that what that meant to those artists, that they wanted to have American work on the international stage. So I could talk for hours on this, but I'll let
That's
someone else
great.
go
That's
from
great.
there.
That's great.
I could just say
Yeah.
that the Unima is how I entered. I mean, I came to New York actually, and then I found out about Unima, and so that Unima just feels like a big part of how we.
But actually, you told me once that the television special that my father did on
Yes.
the Unima Festival,
Yes.
the 1980 festival, that impacted your sense of what puppetry was.
Totally, I saw that when I was like 10 to see, and it was on our public television station, and it was called Here Come the Puppets, and it was a TV show about this international puppetry festival, and it had a big impact on me.
And likewise, I saw his special Muppets on Puppets,
Yeah.
which was on PBS in the early 70s. And that was another, for me, opening the doors for possibilities. And at the end of that, they talked about the Detroit Institute of Arts and writing to them and P of A, and that's how I made all those connections. But that was one of the exposures that, that really.
So I think the word exposure is really important, because I think that having the next generation and the next generation exposed to work and having the opportunity to explore and to figure out what's out there, because there is a lot out there. So I think that learning and exposing new artists to this art form
In the 90s,
is very important.
in the 90s, Henson festivals had a huge
Yeah.
impact in creating
Absolutely.
an audience and inspiring
Yeah.
artists.
And I think the Henson Festival is bringing international work to New York, and I think that was extremely important. And I feel like something shifted drastically. I mean, I feel like that was a very different. I hadn't been to any of the Unima festivals in the '80s, so I don't know. I know them more historically than from experience, but my sense is that something major changed in that span from '92 to 2000, with that festival kind of igniting the public, La Mama, Dixon Place. I mean, other. Half a dozen DTW.
Although I
half a
will
dozen
say
other
that
places.
La Mama, that Ellen Stewart loved puppetry
Sure.
and started presenting puppetry in,
Sure.
I believe, 1967. I don't know if Denise.
1962,
1962, yes.
Wow.
And so she was a great advocate for puppetry all along. I think that what our festival was able to do is to bring added critical attention
Yep.
and marketing attention, and by partnering with a range of theaters and having this a larger group all happening at the same time gave more attention.
The other part of this also that I would add is that the exposure of theater artists to puppetry, so that puppetry is not just an isolated art form,
Right.
but it's integrated into the language of,
Right.
of designers and directors, and is incorporated to legitimate theater. And
Yeah,
the
yeah.
possibilities there is a whole nother,
Right.
I think, another aspect that we have that has happened, that hopefully will continue to happen.
Absolutely. That was sort of the next thing I was going to get to, but
Okay.
I would add illegitimate theater as well.
Yeah.
But yes,
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 yes.
absolutely, absolutely. No, it became. That's I think what I'd like to get to is how puppetry became integrated in the language of dance, of
Yeah.
experimental work, of
Opera.
Opera, absolutely, absolutely.
You know, at the
You guys
O'Neill,
can
one of the
name more.
early conferences at the O'Neill, the playwrights conference would follow our puppetry
Right.
conference. And one year we had the playwrights come early so they could see our closing performances of our conference. and therefore the playwrights were exposed to the work that we were doing. And it was something that we explored.
And did writing come out? Writing for puppet theater come out of that?
Well, it's a component of
Yeah.
our conference,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Pam Arciero was
Yeah.
here
I know.
could talk to that.
Yeah.
But it certainly is part of the development of the work.
Cool, that's great.
Lion King was a big watershed moment, I think, in '97
Right.
for American puppetry and people's, the popular, because it was on Broadway and
Yeah,
people
yeah.
saw it, and it was, just a picture that people saw communicated so much about.
For sure, for sure. I mean, Lion King, War Horse a bit later was a big one, I think. And certainly the arrival of Kentridge's productions at the public through the festival were
And Robert
very, very
Lepage
important.
through the
Right.
festival.
That's right, that's right, that's right.
And wasn't, as a part of the festival, wasn't there a critics panel to educate the theater critics in terms of what they were going to see at the festival? There was a special,
Yeah. And also just doing panels to talk about theory and history and ideas to sort of raise the dialogue. It was very exciting. But I also want to, just as I want to call out Ellen Stewart having a passion for puppetry, that David White at Dance Theater Workshop had a great eye for puppetry and was presenting puppetry before we were, and he really helped to introduce me to the whole downtown theater scene. So I think that there were a number of different presenters that were interested in puppetry, but to get that extra push.
Yeah.
But I think that the exposure and the artists today that saw work in the festival, but so many of the young artists today were too young to see work in the festivals, but maybe their teachers like Dan Herlin had a very active role in the festival, or Janie Geyser, who had a very active role in the festival. And so that it continues, the ripples continue to go out.
Absolutely. No, that's why I mentioned Sarah Lawrence with Lake Simon teaching there now after Dan's departure. Kim, sorry, you were going to jump in a second ago, and I think I
I think I was just going to say that
blew over you.
by the time I found out about, because I moved to New York from Philadelphia in '99, and I'd come up a couple times to see the festival, and it was just transformational because there's companies from all over the world, and by the time I started creating my own work, I was just heartbroken that the festival had stopped. I'm like, I want to be in this thing. Yeah, and then I met Basil, and I was in his show, Petrushka, which is pictures out there that brought back a lot of memories. And then Here Art Center produced 2 of my shows. I wasn't aware at all that there's a network of puppetry, because when I came to New York with my show, I found the only place that I knew, which was the New York International Fringe Festival. It was not puppet specific at all. This is everything avant-garde, shoestring budget, you can do your show. And I did that for 3 consecutive years before, in 2000, then I met Basil. I was like, oh, there's dedicated theaters for this art form.
Yeah. I mean, I think the festivals also brought a lot of people out of the woodwork, if that's the sort of the American expression. But, it's like the work was happening here and there, but it wasn't necessarily connected to each other. People weren't necessarily connected. So yeah, I think that it brought visibility to a lot of work and allowed artists to see each other in ways they hadn't.
As we talk about the festival, I need to do a call out to Leslie Ash.
Leslie Ash.
Because Leslie Ash was the producing director of the festival, and she has a new book called Out of the Shadows. And I left a copy at the library. I hope people will explore it and consider buying one, because it really does do a really nice job of talking about this whole history, the long history.
Maybe let's shift a little bit maybe to talking about what it's like to see this work through the camera lens, what it's like to see it as a photographer. I feel like these works are not. I don't mean to use the term negatively, but they're not only documentation, they're artworks, and they capture liveness in a very particular way. Photographing live art is, as I'm sure many of the people in this room know, is hugely challenging. To get something that is both crisp, clean, visible, accurate, and also possesses movement and life is very, very, very difficult. And so I wonder, I mean, not to say tell us your secrets or your tricks, but what do you see in the changes and the developments in the art form from the point of view of a photographer?
A story I can relate or would like to share is this past week. I live in Brooklyn, and a friend from the dog park had come to the exhibit in New York, and I hadn't talked to her, and she specifically came over to me and said, I have to tell you about the photos. And what really, I really responded to when she was talking about the photos is she said she really responded to the puppeteer and the puppet relationship. And she had never known of that relationship and the quality and the range and what was possible there and what was in the photos in terms of that. And I thought that was really perceptive on her part. And I think in terms of where our art form has come, when I started at UConn, it was very much that the puppeteer was neutralized. If he was visible, neutral, and all of the focus was into all of the energy, the animation was into the puppet, and not to distract, not to upstage. And I think that is one trend that we see in terms of the work that's being created today, that the possibility of the puppet as well as the puppeteer, that relationship and how they can respond, and Kevin's work is a perfect example of that, the dynamic and the emotion that's in there. And I would say in terms of process, and in terms of photographing, for me it's a very exciting experience. For example, we were doing the exhibit, and this is in New York, and working long days, and I had to photograph one of the shows at La Mama that evening that was starting the festival, and I was pretty tired. I mean, but I got into that rehearsal hall. They were doing a dress rehearsal.
Which show was that?
It was, I think it was Frederico's show, specifically. Lunch with Sonia. And a movement piece, and it was me and the performers and the puppets. And it was a dance. It was, and it's just, it's interactive. It is very much, I'm composing as what I'm seeing in front of me. It's a very give and take. And I like to use the idea that my picture frame is my proscenium. And what I learned as a director, a puppet director and all of that goes into how I'm composing what I'm seeing in front of me. And having that freedom, especially with an open piece like Federico's, where I was able to move with it and compose with it, is optimum and truly energizing.
And can you say something about about photographing Basil's work?
Well,
just curious what that's.
Well, this last piece that he was performing for the Asia, for example, the Asian consul, and we were in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and heights are not my particularly, and he was up there on the stool with his stick man figure. And I mean, it's just there again, the performer and the puppeteer and the puppet, and seeing that interact and to see what's beyond. It's also what's in front, but it's what's beyond and how that all interacts together in terms of how that composition is.
You must see this photograph. You must see it.
Richard's been photographing my work for 25 years.
And I can't typify also is the other thing is, if you were to say what's it like, Basil's, the range of his work is extraordinary and so varied. So it...
But you mentioned or maybe your bio mentioned starting photographing backstage at Sesame Street. Is that right?
So when I was dabbling in photography, and Jan Stafura Rosenthal, who I went to college with, got me my interview at Muppets, and it was a close friend. We went to UConn together, and she was dabbling in studying photography, and seeing her lead, I'll try the camera. And when I started working on Sesame Street, Carol Lee Wilcox, who was the head of the workshop, I should talk out here, excuse me, would have us document what we were creating in the workshop, so that when we built something, either a character or a prop, she would have us go on set to follow through and to see the technique, see how successful it was, do the rigging for it, and really learn in that process. At the same time, we would have a camera on set, and we would document what we were building and what was being shot. So that was a way of using the camera there, and which was going into our files. And there was an on-set photographer. And I thought, I'm enjoying this.
That's a job, yeah.
That's something, and freelance.
Right.
And so that started the ball rolling.
Got it.
And eventually, you know, I had year contract, and I was able to, they gave me the flexibility so that when I started taking classes and studying, I said, oh, well, can I take off this time when we're off season instead of going on to other projects? And I ended up at Williamstown at the theater festival as the festival photographer, doing things like that. And that was about 7 years. And then I said, okay, I'm ready to go into and try this freelance full time. And Sesame Street became, and Muppets became my first real clients.
There's a lovely photo in the exhibit also from backstage of Symphonie Fantastique. It's one of my favorites.
Great.
I'm a sucker for backstage tricks, so of course.
Yeah. To see that.
Really love that one. But should we open it to some of you? I imagine there are some questions from this distinguished audience. Would anyone like to? Oh, I see a hand, but it's hard to see. Can you? And I'm going to repeat questions for the recording devices, if that's okay, because there are no mics in the audience. So forgive me if I repeat.
I just realized that I had 3 very important American experiences that are sort of the foundations of the reason why I do puppetry. One is that a friend of mine showed me the Red Book. Because it was called the Jim
Janie.
Henson book,
Oh no, sorry.
made of all the international encounters of the puppeteers that he admired. And when I was looking through the pages, I saw an image of one of Henk Borenkel's puppets. And at that moment, I knew I wanted to do puppetry. So anyway, I'm really grateful for the fact that he produced that book, and I wish I had a copy, but I don't.
Well, it's not actually a book that was published, and that was more of a archive project that Karen Falk did to illustrate the notations that my father did in his journal diary. And what that's referring to mostly is a series called Jim Henson Presents, where my father did 6 one-hour documentaries about 6 of his favorite individual puppet artists from around the world. So it was from 6 countries. So it was Albrecht Roser from Germany, Hank Bordewinkel from Holland, Sergei Obraztsov from Russia, Richard Bradshaw from Australia, Philippe Gentil from France, Bruce Schwartz from the United States. And one of the things that my father was most excited about puppetry was puppetry as an individual expression. So each of these artists were really making puppetry their own. And Hank Bordewinkel's work was so out of the imagination. He literally had these images where you'd open up the head and the characters would be climbing out of the brain. And all kinds of stuff with really wild arts imagery. And I traveled with my father on some of these different shoots. And my sister Heather also traveled on a few of the different shoots. And it was really a fantastic thing to get to do, go around the world. Now, those were very hard to see in the United States because they were collaborations with the public broadcasters in those countries. But in the United States, it was not so easy. But you actually can see them now. They're available on a streaming service that is attached to many of the public libraries. So if you have a public library card, you can see them, stream them online now.
If you have a public American library.
Yes,
Probably right.
probably. But
What I saw was a book, actually, a book that a friend of mine had. That I thought it was called The Red Book, but I know it was Jim Henson. I know it was the encounter with those different puppeteers.
There's this new book, the Out of the Shadows, that Leslie
yeah.
Ash just did of the festivals, and she does talk about those there. And there's just one spread in Jim Henson, The Works. So, yes, but I do think that he had such a love for the international artists, and that he worked to try to bring attention to them. And there are some of the international artists that he had as guests on The Muppet Show in the 70s, and that also brought more exposure to fine artists, fine puppet artistry.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that, if we were to, look at the tree and the development of puppetry in America, and to follow its roots in terms of contemporary, back to the Henson, to Jim Henson and Jane Henson and the Henson family, I think we could trace a majority of the work and the inspiration and the really the development of.
Although there are the other branches from Peter Schumann,
Yes.
because you have the Peter Schumann branch,
Yes.
and you have the Jim Henson
Right.
branch, and you have the Bill Baird branch too. So and then you go back to the Tony Sarg. So I'm sure
Right.
that you all
but
would
they do
love to do the
intersect,
history.
and a majority
Absolutely.
of trends today.
And also how those three men all knew each other quite well,
The
and
irony
had
of that,
such
yes.
a. Oh, I don't find it irony at all that they loved
Yeah,
each other.
sure.
That there's a true friendship.
Yes, yes, yes.
There.
Yes.
And so there was never, I think that later on, the
Yeah.
interpretation of some kind of competitive thing,
Yeah.
that there really wasn't.
Yeah.
That they really
Peter
liked each
Schumann
other.
And Jim Henson and Bill Baird.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or at least Jim Henson and Bill Baird, and Jim Henson and Peter Schumann.
Ah.
I actually don't know if Bill and Peter were friends or not.
But it's true, and I was thinking about Schumann's sort of presence and role in this as a German national moving to the U.S. in the early '60s, and this may be a moment to also flag one of the other exhibits that's on along Rue Bernard and Van Horn in the Marionnette en Vitrine. Exhibits curated by Alexa Smith, who's here. 30 plus storefronts with bread and puppet banners, puppets, objects, and some very beautiful displays just in the front lobby here of the Miam of sort of the bread and puppet sort of ethos and aesthetics. But the reason I was thinking about Schumann had to do in a way with the vector, and this is sort of maybe the best word, or force of dance, and the experiments coming from the dance world sort of hitting the puppetry world. And I feel like that's Schumann's origins, but also the importance of folks like Cunningham and Cage, and the next generation following them, the Judson Dance Theater folks, who looked at everyday objects very seriously and treated the body and everyday objects on stage in particular relationships together. Not necessarily the relationship of puppeteer and puppet, but something important entered the avant-garde vocabulary there. And I have a whole list of, again, I apologize for making lists, but Mabou Mines is obviously very importantly Brewer's work and Ruth Malachek's work with puppets, and in a different kind of relationship than I think, let's say, an Unima. They may not have appeared at an Unima festival for, as far as I know, ever, but they held down a kind of an important aspect of puppetry coming out of the visual art world, with early work with like Richard Serra and other minimalist artists, Philip Glass, and then working with ventriloquism or pseudo ventriloquism, I guess you might say, and working with technology, experimenting with sound. So the avant-garde was also taking up puppet theater. Robert Wilson, I would put Janie Geiser in that camp. Theodora Skipetaris, a good name to shout out. And though Roman Posca, of course, Paul Zaloom maybe on the fringes of that, but and the roots of
Eric
that
Bass.
kind of. Sorry?
Eric Bass.
Eric Bass, right, that's right, in the house. But the roots of that come a little bit from Brecht, Artaud, Eisenstein, Meyerhold, the early decades of the 20th century experimentation with the body in non-realistic, non-naturalistic forms of dramaturgy that included objects, scenery, abstraction, etc. So I think that preaching to the choir, I know here with this group, but that's another vector sort of that hits American puppetry, I think, at this time. So how do we connect that to Pee-wee's Playhouse? I'm not sure, but he's in there too. I do want to go back to the question about what you all see today in terms of the stories being told. What stories are being told? What artists are creating new works for puppetry that we didn't see 10, 20, 30 years ago? I think there's been, especially with the pandemic, especially with the explosion of performing online, there has been so much work that we're getting to see. A lot of work from Baltimore now, a lot of amazing puppet theater. The Chicago Festival has all kinds of new artists, and so I don't know. I thought maybe you guys could speak a bit about what's happening now. I'm looking at you. I'm not sure.
Sure. Well, I think these folks could answer that more comprehensively, because for myself, my work takes so long to make. So I'm in my studio building and writing and directing it myself, so it just takes a long time to kind of figure it out and create it. So I don't get out much.
I hear you.
I'm not, so you're in the realm of more like an overview of kind of the academia of puppetry, but for me, I just want to perform. So wherever I fit in, that's so yeah.
Fair enough.
Well,
Yeah,
I'll talk
sure.
a little bit
Yeah.
about puppetry during the
Yeah.
pandemic,
Yeah.
because we did a full wall of puppetry during the pandemic, and we were so excited that Richard was gung-ho to go out and shoot, regardless of everything else happening in the world. He's like, yeah, let's go and do that. And the Jim Henson Foundation did mini residency grants to 6 different theaters, 3 of those theaters in New York. And here, Dream Music Puppetry was one of the theaters that we worked with, and that each of those theaters chose the artists that they wanted to give mini residency grants with an eye towards who they might want to present, and also to encourage artists who were not necessarily already in the new artists that they hadn't presented before, in particular with an eye towards BIPOC artists and African American artists, and artists who were not necessarily focused on puppetry, but might be strong performers in other ways that wanted to experiment with puppetry. And Puppet Showplace was one of the first ones to do the Black puppeteer cohorts and really encourage artists to explore and experiment with puppetry. And I think coming out of those mini residencies that there's one really fantastic ones that Denise Greber presented in the Jumpstart program at La Mama, and that here will be presenting at Puppetopia, their festival coming up in May, and that Dixon Place already did presentations with some last spring, and will be doing again in June with some of the others. And so I feel like the fact that these theaters just jumped in and offered their empty theaters and their support, and that they helped to bring attention to these artists and to give the artists a sense that it mattered, that they cared, that the producers cared what they were going to make. And I think that having that watchful eye makes a huge difference.
Especially during when you weren't necessarily making a show for people,
Right.
just to do the work. That was.
And then there became a digital component to it as well, which hopefully in terms of live theater, it will go back into live, but in terms of the isolation of COVID and creating digitally and sharing that way.
Well, I think there's something very exciting specifically about the puppetry world. It's maybe why I'm attracted to it, is because it's a home for people who don't know they're doing puppetry yet, in some cases, or they're experimenting, or maybe they're, fiber artists, and suddenly have an urge to perform with the things they've been making, or they're paper mache artists, or whatever. And the openness of puppetry curation, I find, and puppetry presentation will often sort of bring in artists who don't quite know yet that that's the home they want to land in. But I find that incredibly exciting.
I think that's how Atlanta XPT started, was
Okay.
to encompass artists that are outside the puppet.
That's how Janie started.
Right.
She was the illustrator.
Right.
And Theodora,
Right.
it was sculptures.
Was a sculptor.
Then she
right,
started
right,
to animate.
For sure. And also, I actually want to shout out to Louise and Castelier for last year's festival, which was the pandemic festival, where I guess we could say the plan B of the festival, when no live audiences were permitted, was to give each company a residency in a space, basically golden opportunity to work in a beautifully, this space or the Obero or Théâtre Autrement, and then present something at the end, or present a video excerpt for the web, but without the pressure of finishing your show. Very, very valuable. So sort of taking the pandemic and making something, more than useful, but beautiful.
And I have to say, I think that some of the work coming out of the pandemic is particularly excellent. And it just has the sense that the artists have really honed their craft, and they've really made each moment really matter. And I will point out that I think that Kevin did a particularly good job of that with Body Concert, that every moment in that piece feels like you've really worked it and made it just right. And I don't know whether or not that would have been the same if you hadn't had 2 years or a year and a half in isolation.
Alone.
I think you're right, that because it was supposed to happen at La Mama a year prior, and I was so disappointed when it didn't, but having that time, that extra time, I just kept working it, kept exploring it. And I told this story before, but when we did it in October at the La Mama Puppet Festival, I had, prior to that, I'd been doing it as I thought traditionally it should be done, all in black, and I'm wearing the mask and the unitard, and just having that extra time allowed me to see it in a different way, that there's another possibility, and say, well, no, maybe show it without the mask and show the skin. And so I'm so grateful that I did have that time to keep on exploring.
Yeah, we met at the hotel today, and I photographed several of his productions, and I've never seen him without makeup, or I didn't know him. I was meeting him for the first time.
Who's that guy?
It's the truth.
Right.
It's fun.
More questions or comments from you all? Yeah.
I have a question. So I love having Richard photograph my work as well, and I think every puppeteer, that's what they want. But what I love most about it is goes beyond photography. It's going back to Richard and saying, what are your notes? And I'm curious about the conversations that you have with artists because you're seeing them through the lens. Or do you often? I know I ask.
I will just say that I have a very critical eye, because I've seen a lot, and I certainly I have notes here, and I keep them here for, recently there was a puppeteer, I saw their virtual work, and I did give him some notes, and it was a little uncomfortable, but I cared for what he's doing, and it's going to go to the next stage in production, and I took the liberty of saying how much I loved it, and these are two things that really jumped out at me. I have to be very careful, though. And I've been asked to write reviews and that sort of thing, and it's not a good idea. I want to continue working.
I have to say that also with the foundation, that we have given over 1,000 grants for the creation of new work since 1982, and that we look at about 140 applications every year. And we cut those in half, and then we look at full applications for about 65. And that Richard has been reading these ever since 1987.
Oh, boy.
And so you do get to a place where you are looking at a lot of ideas, and that it actually is important not to give notes, that we actually try to stay neutral as much as possible.
And I just would add to Cheryl, in terms of the process of how we review and we score and how that's all put together and how it's narrowed down to the final grant recipients, it is such a thorough process of working on our own and then collectively, and how that's all tabulated. It is such a thorough and detailed process. It feels not at all like a personal. It feels like a very objective and informed and considered selection process. I must say it really is excellent.
And we keep 10 to 12 board members, so there's always at least 10 active in the process, so that to really buffer any overly personal relationships that people might have with specific artists. But it is a little bit tricky because sometimes you do want to jump in and give notes, and you really shouldn't.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I think one of the differences I've learned of in having a foot both in the U.S. and Canada is the difference in funding structures. And for puppeteers who are emerging, let's say, or maybe not completely starting, but who are starting to be ready to have their work seen more widely and developed more deeply, the foundation grants are a kind of critical first step. And there's not the same availability of funding. I think it's I'm saying it very politely, but there really is not the same funding at all stages. And I know it probably doesn't feel that way, but I think in Quebec and with the Canada Council and funding here, there certainly are more, there's more availability at the different levels of development here. And in the States, it's sort of like, you're really on your own for a very long time until you reach a certain point career-wise, and the Henson Foundation grants are absolutely critical in this field.
They're
it can't be
critical,
overstated.
But they're small.
No,
but they're very. But I do want to say that
we
do not fund entire shows. People are very much on their own, and that people are so hungry for the Henson grants because there's so little out there for funding puppetry, and that is a real struggle, and that all of these artists are really they're working on the fringe of the funding opportunities.
No, and I would say the same for Heather's, for the Puppet Slam Network grants, which are not huge amounts of money, but they leverage a huge amount of work. It's quite incredible.
Actually, as artists, do Basil or Kevin want to talk about that?
Applying and receiving, luckily, several Henson grants over the years for my work has been just indispensable. And what's so great, it's tiered, that there's a workshop grant. So when you're just kind of figuring it out, you have to have enough. I've noticed it's changed, it's evolved, because I think there's much more competition now. There's so many more puppet pokes. So originally when I started, it was like, you just send us a drawing. But now it's like, no, we want to see. You got to get more. I want to see the puppet. And so it's much more rigorous. But there's the first stage when you're still kind of figuring it out and experimenting, and then there's the production grant, which I have an application in right
now. But they're small grants, and that the artists really have to go out into their community. They cannot. They're small grants. And I wish that there was more funding for puppetry across the board.
Yeah.
Hello, sorry, asking for a friend, but
I-
I know that in the 80s, a Mexican troupe called Palo de Lluvia went to the Puppeteers of America Festival and was awarded something very important. It was actually a shadow theater troupe. But throughout the years, I actually don't feel that a lot of Mexican groups go to the U.S.
Yeah.
or that a lot of the U.S. puppeteers, it's an amazing thing what you
Yeah.
have described today,
Yeah.
have come to Mexico. So I just wanted to ask, what do you think are the obstacles for our two,
Yeah.
the Mexican puppet scene and the American puppet scene, to establish more solid?
Yeah. There was, I'll just from my own company's perspective, we were part of a U.S.-Mexican exchange that I think the Henson Foundation might have had something to do with. There was another foundation as well. I don't know if it was Ford. I won't remember off the top of my head, but there was a foundation-funded U.S.-Mexico exchange, and Facto Teatro came to New York and performed. Pablo Cueto and Alejandro Benitez came, and others. But that's a long time ago. And then we went and did some workshops in Mexico City. But that's one small example, and there should be a much more exchange. I completely agree. And with Canada too, I think there should be much more exchange. Mexico, Canada, Mexico, Quebec would be great. But I can't speak to obstacles. Maybe Louise, maybe you can, or I don't know if anyone else could comment on that.
Well, there's no obstacles
Right.
between Canada and Mexico.
Right. No, right. I mean, I'm just asking about.
No, but I think it's the visa problem also in the States. It's so difficult to
Yeah.
tour in the States for the companies of Canada and abroad because of the visas.
Right.
So I think that's one thing, the obstacle. This was my question. Do you feel you are confronted enough with international shows? Because there's so much going on now in America. It's so exciting. But do you feel you have enough international feet?
There's a relationship with the French. There's funding from France, and that's also, we participated in bringing shows from France together. But I'd say that that's sort of unique, because that's also France, which is unique. So there isn't.
And that you have a wonderful show coming in May.
Well, we have Anywhere, which was here 2 years ago at the festival, Théâtre de l'Entrouvert, with the incredible puppet made of ice, and we brought it to New York right after, just days after it was here, and then everything closed. So we had to cancel it, so we're bringing it back in May. And that was an easy request, because the French said, of course we want this to happen, so it's supported. But it's true that getting support for other artists to come, I mean, La Mama's had more international artists, I'd say.
I was going to say also, maybe not as true lately, but for a stretch, Lincoln Center was bringing a lot. Like I remember the Rezo Gabriadze shows that came to Lincoln Center, which were also with what's been in the news lately. I've just been thinking about the Battle of Stalingrad show. But again, these are sort of individual examples that are maybe more exceptions.
That's why festivals like the Henson Festival for 10 years and the Sandglass Puppet Festival, and also what's happening now in Chicago, they are main levers for our profession. I think it's so wonderful to have festivals.
Yes.
I think the visas have gotten more expensive. We started a travel grant in honor of Ali Lou Curtin, who was my mentor, and she was the Unimama. She was very active as the general secretary of Unima, and she passed away. So we started Ali Lou Awards, which is a $5,000 travel grant for a U.S. company going to an international festival and an international artist coming to a U.S. festival. And it's not always easy to find shows coming, because $5,000 is barely enough to cover the visa. So.
I can speak to that in the inverse, because I got a travel grant, luckily enough, to come here. And I was the same grant. I was trying to pair it. I was trying to apply again to pair it with going. I was invited to Holland and Mexico, but the grant won't allow to go to one country and come back and then go to another country. It has to happen in one plane flight. So there's limitations, and in my experience, that's the trickiest part, because I really want to share my work. I want to be one of those international folks who are bringing to other countries and cultures, but it always comes down to the money. It's so tough to, a festival, it's usually you have to find your own money to travel. And if I applied here for this year, then you have to wait a year or two before you can apply again. So,
And one thing I think that, I mean, the model from Castelier is a very good model, and other exchanges that I've experienced have taught that going once isn't necessarily enough. It's really to build a relationship. It's, you want to travel somewhere, bring, and also invite, have an exchange, a reciprocal exchange, where it's back and forth multiple times, and then you start to know each other, and the work starts to, people's work changes each other's work. So that's happened. That's happened here in this space already, right? With some exchanges. Yeah.
It comes to mind also not only shows and productions, but teaching. And I just want to mention today on my way here, a friend of mine from the University of Connecticut, who was several years before me, Janet Beth Johnson, in her late 70s passed away, and I just got word of it today. But I worked with her at UConn, and in the 70s, she came here to work with Lottie Reiniger on a master class for a week long. I believe it was a week long intensive. But Jenna Beth was dedicated to and was at the forefront of the development of overhead shadow puppetry. And in the 60s and the 70s with Frank Ballard, and she produced a booklet on that, which was sold in the P of A Festival. So I would just like to acknowledge her legacy today, and really a wonderful artistic and supportive and a student of Frank Ballard. And I just publicly would like to acknowledge her life and her career.
And I learned that technique from Great Small Works, which was like,
But what I'm curious about, so when you say here, Lottie Reiniger was teaching in Montreal?
Yes, in Quebec.
Quebec,
Yes,
okay,
and
I'm sure you guys would
does
know.
that ring a bell?
Would know. Well, Matt would know.
Whereabouts? I don't know whereabouts. I know her
Yeah,
work,
yeah.
but whereabouts was
You
she
know, I
teaching?
don't know the location, but I know that she came up here and was in residence for at least a week with her, studying, and this was in the late 70s, I believe. Yeah.
I'll look it up.
Yes, please. I'm going to do the same, do a search on that. But
Other comments or questions from the distinguished panel? Mouth, and then someone I can't see at the top. Mouth, you first, and then someone way up top.
Just a short comment. I know artistically wise, I've been a lot influenced by American puppetry. Festival, Jensen Festival, I worked also as a young puppeteer with Peter Sussman and all the group of the Bread and Puppet. And also the artists, the artistry. You were talking about Bob Wilson before. It's so near in directing, for example. The American influences have been great, So the exchanges, they are sometimes abstract. It's not an exchange in money-wise or tours, but as an artist, it's been very, very strong. And also your company, Mark, Great Small Works. Yes, because
We exist. We still exist.
yeah, long time.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's been a while. Yeah, I mean, we certainly know something about working in New York with limited resources and keeping a studio going and sharing a studio with other artists, and that's a very interesting model that seems to resist the economy, how the economy goes up and down. We sort of can can continue.
To add that as a puppeteer, but also as a teacher, I brought my students a lot in the States to see some shows and to meet some artists, like, for example, Theodora and other artists. And, you know, I think this is very rich, and we don't really talk about that because we don't know about that, you know, so.
Well, I was going to mention training programs, and I mean, for people who don't know, Marthe founded the DESS de marionnette contemporain here in UQAM, University of Quebec here, but I was thinking about the teaching network, both at places with puppetry programs, like obviously University of Connecticut is sort of a major center, but also places that have maybe not a full MFA, but have coursework like CalArts or Sarah Lawrence, or probably you guys know of many others, probably SAIC in Chicago, art schools where there's a performance program, and within that performance program there's always going to be some folks who are working with puppets, sculptors, objects, fiber artists will come to puppetry that way. So that's also a very limited network, but each school has quite an important ripple effect and quite an important influence. So now you have folks who've graduated from CalArts now. I think of like someone like Tori Bend at Duke, for example. Right? Is she at Duke? You know, and her students are coming and doing shows now. So it's quite exciting to see. But yeah, I absolutely remember the DOSS students in New York visiting Theodora's studio. That was a great moment. Yeah. Sorry, you had a question way up there. Yeah.
I was just going to say that when my kids were young, they're in their 20s now, their big experience of their lives in the summer was to go down and hang out at Bread and Puppet and watch. It's an enormous spectacle with hundreds of people in costume and present and physical. And I look at them now, and I look partly because of COVID, I guess, but generally in their experience now, most of what they're getting is online. Most of it is digital. It's not physical. And I really sort of deeply miss the physicality of all that stuff. And I was wondering if you had any comment on that, on how to keep that up.
Well, I sure do.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
But we all do. We are just continuing outside in nature with giant apprenticeships and exchanges and global interactions at Bread and Puppet. And it's a really powerful experience during the pandemic to manage thousands of people in an environment of radical criticism and a lot of art making and a lot of different languages. We've been continuing to do the old Hallelujah show that many of you remember from New York and seen forever. The last year I counted we do this performance in all of the languages of all of the puppeteers who are with us on that day. And so we performed it 3 giant circuses and pageants a week for the last 2.5 years, and I counted 21 different languages in translation.
That's great.
And last year 18. So in terms of global interaction and that you were discussing, it's so vibrant and alive to work with people from all over the world across the table in the morning and then going out into the field. And I highly recommend it to get your kids off the jam and cheese and have them on. We need the people to experience it and the youth to experience it and to eat good bread and to walk around the streets and take fresh air and look in the windows and reminisce about the frog and some of the puppets you've seen from the old days. But I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to just stand up and say that puppetry is radical and revolutionary, and we have to keep eating bread and making crazy things.
Yeah, she curated the exhibit here.
Understand that we are all together, all these people from these different countries. There's too many white people in this room right now.
It goes like 500 objects. It goes like a truck with like 500 objects.
And that's where we have to do our work. And, you know, Peter has been making over 1 to 2 giant bed sheets, painting these thrown away bed sheets from hospitals every single day of the pandemic. So I was running around on the street paper macheing them to walls, hanging them in windows, just going around. And so this kind of idea that we need to figure out how to do theater in other places because we can't necessarily be in these little teeny places. So I think it's so interesting to think, how are we doing the radical work that needs to be done in places that they weren't done? You know, we got really trapped in our spaces, and now we have to move into new spaces, like out in the fields and the farms and in the streets. And we have a parking lot dance companies that are forming all around Vermont that are bread and puppet satellites. So if you want to dance in a parking lot, that's what's happening now.
Thanks, Alexis, for that shout out. That's good. Other comments, other questions for this esteemed
Actually, could I
panel?
comment on
Please,
that? Just
please,
because I
please.
feel like there's so many artists that learned to bring their work online
Yeah.
over the course of the pandemic,
Yeah.
and we're really experimenting with video and with film and with editing. And so I think that there is a whole new group of work that's coming out online and on video, but that for me personally, it's the live puppetry when the character is coming to life. That life is happening in front of you without any digital or film magic at all. It is just the relationship between the puppeteer and the puppet and the audience, and that dynamic and that belief that it is suddenly alive, that happens in live theater. So I want to just say I love live theater.
Absolutely.
I'm glad people are experimenting and doing all this other stuff, but
Absolutely.
let's keep it live also.
Absolutely. Yay. Absolutely. I do want to, I had made my little list of forces or vectors on American puppetry, and dance was one of them. But I did want to just shout out also to the history of sort of experiments with art and technology. This is not to, this is as a complement to championing the live. But the live also, I think it's like the director Elizabeth LeCompte of the Worcester Group has talked about how, she thinks of her work as realism, and when she was growing up in the 50s, the TV was in the house and it was always on. So there was video in her shows because there was TV in the world, and it was doing its own thing, and the actors were doing their thing, and it had a kind of, relationship, particular kind of relationship of sort of multiple points of focus on the stage. And I think that there's a way in which, prior to the pandemic, a lot of puppeteers were we're continuing to bring screens into their work. We're beginning to bring live video into their work. I mean, it's an extension of projection, really. So there's also a way in which the sort of body-machine relationship is very much taken up by puppet theater, I think. And many of you do that work, and I find that kind of exciting. So yes, I think the pandemic suddenly flattened everything onto the screen, and that was kind of interesting, but also kind of painful as the years went on. But there is something interesting about the cheapness of the technologies now, and the way we can bring simultaneity into the stage, and magic in certain kinds of magic can interact with puppetry in interesting ways. So that's another thing to add to the long list. Yeah.
I just want to add to Cheryl's comments. I completely agree with the flatness, and it was very painful over COVID not to be in the theater and not to be able to feel the breath of the actor sharing space with you. But I work with Gail and Neil, and we decided to continue to educate and develop work as a SOS for the artists. These people who were stuck in their homes and needed support in the storytelling.
Yeah.
So it was as much about building skills and story as it was emotional support and holding space for each other. So what I loved about that time was the artist being able to look at a camera and say, imagine me in a field. I'm at the top of a hill, or I'm in a van. They started telling where they would be that wasn't necessarily in the theater. Some would say, I'm in a black box. But it gave us space to say, okay, I'm still inside, you're still inside, but I'm going to speak to her on the outside. And so
Yeah.
I think being prepared to perform outside and in a space that doesn't feel too closed in is a beautiful gift that we've been able to receive.
Yeah.
You know, it forced us out of the box.
Yeah. No,
And
it
to
was-
be able to connect internationally too during that time, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
astounding.
No, it was a lifeline in many ways, yeah. And again, a lot of the events supported by the Puppet Slam Network, a lot of cabarets and puppet slams were taking place. Some we organized here.
The toy theater moment
Yeah.
that happened, that Great Small Works
fantastic.
did at the beginning of the pandemic was
It was like April 6th or
amazing.
something.
It was so
yeah.
good.
It was amazing because toy theater can actually sometimes be hard to relate to if it's in a bigger space
Sure.
or you're not sitting in the right place.
Yeah.
And every show was perfect on this. It was so,
Yeah, no,
it was
It
thrilling.
fits this nicely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's true. It's true. And we had some evenings in that series that where we had, because afterwards we would have all the artists would be on Zoom together live, so, just to sort of greet each other. So there was one I remember where there was someone in Tehran in Iran, someone in Jakarta, you know, folks in New York, folks in California, you know, all over, Mexico. You know, and them just being in this virtual space, even though Zoom is horrible, but there was something very moving about people just waving from their little video boxes and feeling connected to something. You know, it was quite nice. So.
I think also just going back to the work.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I want to see what that does. I know being in a theater again, doing the work again is like, it's an emotional, it vibrates. I vibrate with it. And I think that is something that we need to use that energy, that perspective to where we go next.
Yeah, yeah.
That's, I think,
Well, that's such a good last word. But so that's beautiful, Richard. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone, but I do want to say that the experience of walking through the exhibit across the street, I just again want to recommend it to you. Yeah, these photographs really bring the work to life and keep the liveness of the work very, very present. So do check it out. And yes, the marionnette en vitrine is still up, so check that out too. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Louise and Castilla. And Liz. That was very nice.
Well done.
That was very